Welcome to lesson 63, where we're going to be talking about circles and completing the square here today. We've talked about recently a lesson about parabolas, and in our parabolas, what our goal was we had to graph that parabola. Well, to graph our parabola, we had to have it in what was called work format. Work format was allowing us to pick out what was that vertex and also the direction and the width of our parabola. We'll see some of the same steps here today as we're looking at lesson 63 with our circles and completing the square. Well, just like we had with our parabolas, in order to graph, we had to have our equation in what was called that standard format or the work format. What does that look like for our circle? We talked about this earlier this year. Our work format or standard format had our two parentheses, x minus 8 squared plus y minus k squared is equal to r squared. Remember, the x and the y are the two variables, and those always stay in your equation. Your h, k, and r are the three pieces where there's going to be numbers located in your equation. With our equation being in the standard format, we're able to pick out the two pieces necessary in order to graph our circle. The first piece is that center. Now, the center of our circle is going to be located at h, k. Notice the h and the k are inside of the parentheses, which means when we go to use those numbers, we're going to have to be picking the opposites because of the fact they're in parentheses. The radius is going to be on the side by itself, and we'll see an example in just a second as to how to pick those numbers out here. Let's actually go ahead and look at that right now. We have our equation in our standard format, x minus 2 squared plus y minus 4 squared is equal to 9. If I had asked you to graph that circle, there's two things that you had to know. The first thing that you had to know was the center. Now remember, the center is located for the numbers that are inside of those parentheses. That means the center of our circle is going to be located at 2, 4. Notice how I picked the opposite out of both of our parentheses. The second thing that would be necessary is our radius. Now remember, in that standard format, the equation said r squared. So in order for us to pick out the radius of our equation, we need to decide what did I square to get the number that's on the right side. Well, how do I get a 9? That means I had squared a 3, which means the radius on our equation is 3. Our goal in our lesson today is to have our equation in this standard format so we can easily pick out these two pieces of information so we can either graph or describe what the graph would look like. Now, the equations that are going to be given to us today are in what's called general format. What did that mean? That an equation was in general format, there were no parentheses. We could multiply the parentheses out from the standard format using our FOIL method, and then we had to rearrange the terms. In order to rearrange the terms, everything had to be on one side of the equation, meaning the equation has to be set equal to 0. Let's go back and look at that equation that we just walked through that was in standard format, and let's see how we can put that into general format. Well, the first thing to put this into general format is I'm going to go ahead and square both of those parentheses. To square, we have our little shortcuts that will help us, and if you don't remember those, of course, we can always FOIL. Once I square both of our parentheses, that leads us to the equation that we see. X squared minus 4x plus 4, and then the second parenthesis would be plus y squared minus 8y plus 16, and our equation is still equal to 9. Well, that was step number 1 in turning it into general format. We got rid of the parentheses. Step number 2 is we want to rearrange the terms. Now, in general format, it kind of goes in order. All the squared pieces are first, then all the regular variables, and then we have the constants at the end, and our equation is still equal to 0, and you can see how I did that on the screen. I put our x and our y squareds first, then I put the two pieces that had x and y, and I combined our like terms for the constant. On the left side were originally the 4 and the 16, so I put those together to make it 20, and I subtracted the 9 over, so 20 minus 9, that's where that 11 came from that you see on our equation. Our general format is now equal to 0, and that's one of the qualifications to have it in that general format. Now, this format is not helpful when it comes to graphs. So what we're going to see today is our question starts in this general format, and we're going to have to work backwards to what we see up there in yellow to turn it into that standard format or our work format. Well, in order to go from general format to standard format, there's a couple steps that we need to follow, and here what we have. The first thing that says you're going to have to complete the square twice. Remember, to complete the square, you're doing half of a certain number, squaring it, and then you add that onto a couple different sides of your equation, and I'll show you how to do that as we work through our example. After we complete our square, and actually here's the steps that we want to follow here. First of all, move your constant over to the right side of the equation. That's not the number that we want there in order to complete the square. Well, notice in standard format, we do have those parentheses. So you want to go ahead and group everything that has an x inside of one parenthesis and everything that has a y inside of the other parenthesis. After we do that, here's where we're finally going to get into that completing the square process, and we have to complete the square twice. Here's where I was mentioning that's when we did half of our coefficient and then we squared it, and then that number appeared on both sides of our equation. Once we've done that completing the square process, we're going to factor. That puts it into our two parentheses that were being squared, and we're going to simplify. We're going to put the numbers together on the right side of our equation so we can put it back into that standard format. Let's go ahead and work through a couple examples together here. So here's our first equation. X squared plus y squared minus 6x plus 8y plus 21 is equal to 0. If I gave you that equation and asked you to graph it, there's currently nothing that you can do. You don't know where the center is and you don't know what the radii is. So we have to work through that idea of putting it into our standard format. So the first two steps I'm actually going to do at the same time. Step number 1 said to move the constant to the right side of our equation, and then step 2 says to group the x's and to group the y's together. Notice I've done that both on this first line. Inside of my first parenthesis, I have x squared minus 6x. Then I still got that plus sign. It's got to be a plus sign in between the two parentheses. If it was a minus, it would be a different shape that we'll talk about later. The second parenthesis, I've located all my y's, y squared plus 8y, and at the same time, I've subtracted the 21 to the right side of our equation. Well, now step number 3 says to complete the square. To complete the square, I do that one parenthesis at a time. If I take a look at the first parenthesis, the coefficient of my x is the number 6. We don't even really care that it says minus 6. We're just caring about the number. Well, in order to complete the square, we had to take half of that number. So half of 6 gave us 3, and then we had to square it. So inside of that first parenthesis, we're going to put a plus 9. We'll follow the same process for our second parenthesis. The coefficient of our y is the number 8. So half of our number 8 gives us 4, and then we'll square that, which gives us 16. I put both of those numbers inside of their corresponding parentheses. Now, because I put a plus 9 as well as a plus 16 on the left side of the equation, to keep the equation balanced, I had to put the plus 9 and the plus 16 on the right side of our equation. We're now ready for step number 4, the final step. We can put it into our work format. To fill in our work format, the blanks kind of follow the question. The first blank, what did you square to get x squared? I squared an x. The last blank, what did I square to get that number 9? I had squared a 3. That sign in the middle is a minus because that's the sign of the middle term that we had in the previous line. Same process on that second parenthesis. The first blank, what did I square to get y squared? I had squared the letter y. The second blank, what did I square to get the 16? I had squared the number 4. The sign in the middle is a plus because of the 8y being a plus on the previous line. I've simplified on the right side of our equation. I put those like terms together. Now that our equation is in our standard format, we can pick out our two essential pieces, which are the center as well as the radius. The center of our circle is going to be located at 3, negative 4. Again, I'm picking the opposite out of those parentheses, and our radius is going to be 2. Those are the two things that I now need to use to correctly graph our circle. When I go to graph the circle, the first thing that we have to use is the center. Remember, we just said the center was located at 3, negative 4. So I moved right 3 and I moved down 4. From that center, I now can move in each direction where the radius is 2. So I went right 2, left 2, up 2, and down 2. And there is our circle that we have located on the Cartesian plane. Hey, and it actually looks like a circle because I didn't have to draw it by hand. I was able to use that on my computer, and hopefully you guys can do the same thing there. So now we have our equation graphed, and we're ready to move on to our next question. Let's go ahead and take a look at this equation. X squared plus y squared plus 4x minus 6y plus 6 is equal to 0. Right now, there's nothing that I know about that equation that will help me graph it. So we need to put our equation into standard format so we can pick out that center and we can pick out the radius. Steps 1 and 2, again, I'm going to combine together. So I'm going to group my x's together in one parenthesis, put my y's in the other parenthesis, and move that 6 to the other side by subtracting it to the right side of our equation. Inside of our parenthesis with the x, our coefficient here is 4, so half of 4 is 2, and we square it, which gives us a 4. For the y parenthesis, half of 6 is 3. We're going to square it. That gives us a 9, and those are the two numbers that I want to add to our left side of the equation. Because those are on the left side, I need to add the exact same numbers to the right side of our equation as well. We're now able to factor, just like we did on the last question, and simplify on the right side of our problem. Now that we have it in standard format, we can pick out our two pieces. Our center is located at negative 2, 3. Now, the radius is a little bit more challenging on this question because there's nothing I can think of. What do I square to get a 7? Well, because the equation said radius squared, that means if I just wanted the radius, I would square root. So to help me find the radius, I took the square root of 7, and that's about 2.65. Now I have my two pieces that I can use to help me graph in my circle. The first thing I did use was my center. In order to get to that center, I moved left 2 and I moved up 3. My radius was right about that 2.65, so I moved in each of my directions and I connected those in order to make our circle. Those are the kind of examples that you students will be responsible for when it comes to our tests and quizzes, but I did want to show you one more example of a circle, one of these that has some coefficients that start in front of our x squared and our y squared. We're still going to follow the same process that we had to complete the square, but there's going to be one extra step that we have to do on our equation. So step number 1 and 2, again, I'm combining together. I group my x's inside one parenthesis, my y inside of the other parenthesis, and I move my constant to the right side of the question. Now here's the one extra step that we're going to have to do. Inside of both of those parentheses, I do not want a coefficient on the squared pieces. Well, what do I have to do to get rid of a 2 that was being multiplied? I'm going to have to divide by 2. Now we know I can't just divide by 2 on one piece of the equation. I'm going to have to do it to every single part of the equation, and you can see how I did that. See why these are a little bit more challenging now, because we have these fractions that are built into our equation. So every single part of my equation, both the left and the right side, has been divided by 2. The parentheses now contain just the x squared and the y squared at the front, and that's what you need in order to complete your square. Do not want that coefficient in front of either the x squared or the y squared. Well, to figure out what do I need to put in order to complete the square. The first parenthesis, my coefficient is 1/2. Well, half of a half would be 1/4, and then I'm going to square that, and that would give me 1/16. The same thing is true about the y parenthesis because I have the exact same coefficient in front of that y. There's my plus 1/16 that I put on both of our parentheses, and I added the exact same thing to the right side of our equation as well. I'm now ready to factor, so that way we're just going to describe because of all these fractions this time. So our first parenthesis, I have x minus 1/4 squared, and then our plus sign again in the middle. That's a requirement for our circle. The second parenthesis, y plus 1/4 squared, and I was able to simplify on the right side by making a common denominator, and that gave me 13/8. Again, we're not going to be responsible for graphing this kind of equation because of all those fractions. We just want to be able to describe it. Well, where do I get those pieces that I can describe it? The center as well as the radius. The center of your circle, that's located inside of your parentheses, again, picking out the opposite. That means the center of our circle was located at 1/4, comma, negative 1/4, and the radius, we know to find the radius, we have to square root the right side of our equation. I took that 13/8 and I square rooted, and that was about 1.27. Again, you can see based on those pieces of information why we're not graphing on this kind of problem. Now, what I would like you to do for your homework when it comes to the questions that tell you to complete the square and then to graph. What I would like you to do is complete the square like I showed you in our lesson here today, but then all I want you to do is just describe each of the circles to me. So what do I mean by describe it? I would like you to tell me where is the center, and I would like you to tell me where is the radius. You do not need to worry about trying to graph that on your paper. Just tell me what are those two pieces after you place that into your standard format. If you have questions about what you're doing from this lesson or as you're working on your homework, of course, feel free to contact me, and I'll be glad to walk you through these different steps. Guys, have a great day. Bye.